Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're launching a bit of a forensic investigation into a massive, multi-billion-dollar shift in the medical field. It's really a fascinating story about legacy giants, agile newcomers, and a fundamental change in how the medicines of tomorrow are actually invented. We're going to map all of this out based on a really incredible scientometric study by researchers Bonhomme, Corbel, and Sebai. So let's dive right in.
You know, the traditional pharmaceutical industry has been facing a pretty serious crisis lately. For decades, they just relied on finding a few blockbuster drugs, those super medicines with global distribution that brought in massive, massive revenue. But recently, the costs of research and development have absolutely skyrocketed. The data actually shows that less than 1 in 100 products in development makes it to the market. Literally, less than 1%. Imagine trying to run a business with those odds. Because of these immense pressures, the old ways of discovering drugs just aren't cutting it anymore. So we really have to ask, when the traditional well runs dry, how do we actually measure where the new innovation is coming from?
To solve this mystery, we're going to follow a logical path right through the data. We'll start by looking at this mutating industry, introduce our investigative tool, which is patent citations, and then examine 3 major clues: the diverse from chemistry, the shift to open R&D, and the role of the university. Finally, we'll uncover the overarching strategy here, which is symbiotic coexistence.
Okay, Section 1, a mutating industry, shifting from closed R&D.
Here's the thing. Unlocking new treatments today requires incredibly complex technologies. We're talking genomics, bioinformatics, combinatory chemistry, and running massive computer model simulations. The established laboratories, the ones we call big pharmas, well, they just couldn't possibly develop all of these brand new competencies in-house. It's too much. And this brings us to our 2 main suspects in the innovation landscape. On one side, you've got the traditional giants, right? Companies like Pfizer, Aventis, Schering, and Daiichi. But on the other side, we have the biotechs. These are the newer, highly specialized, totally technology-driven companies like Amgen, Genentech, and Biogen.
Moving to Section 2, patent citations, mapping knowledge flows. To figure out exactly where these different companies get their knowledge, we need a magnifying glass. Enter the patent citation. Just like the DNA of an invention or, a bibliography at the end of an academic book, every single patent has to list the prior technical knowledge that it's built on. By analyzing who is citing whom in these legal filings, we get a literal paper trail. It's a highly quantifiable way to trace the flow of knowledge from one organization to another. So the researchers actually took a snapshot of all the patents filed in the US by these 7 companies over a full year in 2003. That gave them 723 patents, and get this, over 4,200 individual citations to analyze. And when you lay out that data, really categorizing whether they cite themselves, other pharma companies, chemical companies, or universities, we can immediately see a stark behavioral divide between our traditional labs and the biotech startups. So let's break down the 3 major clues hidden in this data. Clue number 1 in Section 3, the divorce from chemistry, leaving chemistry behind. Historically, the pharmaceutical sector has been intimately tied to the chemical industry, but the data shows a really fascinating split. The biotechs, they have heavily substituted traditional chemistry for new biological and genetic tech. For instance, chemical patents make up only 2.7% of Genentech citations. That is incredibly low. But look at Big Pharma. Daiichi sits at nearly 18%, and Aventis is over 13%. Big Pharma is holding on to its legacy chemistry roots, and this brilliantly illustrates a strategy of risk limitation. The biotechs are out there pushing the absolute frontier, but the traditional giants are keeping one foot firmly planted in the chemistry they already know. They're diversifying their methods rather than just abandoning them entirely. Section 4, a more open R&D, collaborative networks. Moving to our second clue, let's look at self-citation, which basically means an organization citing its own previous patents. Now, high self-citation usually means a company relies heavily on its own internal, closed-door research. Traditional pharma companies have self-citation rates ranging from 22.5% all the way up to a whopping 37.1%. But the biotechs? Significantly lower. Biogen, for instance, only cites itself about 11.9% of the time. Plus, the biotechs average a higher number of total citations per patent overall. What this tells us is that biotechs operate on an open R&D model. They aren't trying to invent every single thing in-house in some secret lab. Instead, they actively collaborate. They heavily rely on outside networks, make frequent cooperation agreements, and constantly build upon external knowledge. They are incredibly porous and collaborative by design. Which leads us to Section 5, the role of the university, fundamental science.
So if biotechs are looking outward for knowledge, who exactly is feeding them the insights they need to build these cutting-edge therapies? Well, when you look at the data plotting the percentage of citations to fundamental research institutions, like universities, against citations to other pharma companies, the three biotechs, Amgen, Genentech, and Biogen, bunch up really tightly. They rely heavily on fundamental science, citing universities at a much, much higher rate than most traditional pharma companies. And honestly, this makes absolute sense when you consider that almost all early specialized biotech firms in the US were actually founded by university professors.
And finally, Section 6, a symbiotic coexistence, explorers and exploiters.
So we've seen that these groups cite different fields and operate with totally different levels of openness. You might think they're bitter rivals, just fighting for the exact same pharmaceutical pie, right? But the data proves a different story entirely, a symbiotic coexistence. In this ecosystem, biotechs act as the agile explorers. They bridge the gap between fundamental university science and practical application. But actually manufacturing complex biological molecules on a global scale, that is incredibly difficult and wildly expensive. That's where Big Pharma comes in. They step up as the commercial powerhouses, utilizing their massive expertise in clinical trials, regulatory approval, and global production. It's literally a perfect pairing of upstream exploration by the biotechs and downstream exploitation by Big Pharma.
So as we wrap up this explainer, we can see exactly how the paper trail of patent citations reveals the hidden architecture of modern medicine. But we really have to wonder, with the constant emergence of entirely new fields like artificial intelligence and nanotechnology, how will the delicate balance of this pharma biotech ecosystem shift in the decades to come? Who's going to be the new explorers and who will be the exploiters? It's definitely something to chew on the next time you hear about a major medical breakthrough. Thanks so much for joining me on this deep dive.